Hi there, John Wilkinson here, and thanks as always for tuning in to my History Made Easier channel. I really hope it's proving useful for you. You know, sometimes questions dictate our essay plan and the direction we take in an essay. I'm going to look at some past questions centred on the causes of World War I that do just that, and show how we have to have the knowledge and the understanding to be able to respond to very different questions. So let's take a look at this. So here's our look at the causes of World War I. And we begin with the classic long-term, short-term causes, or as I prefer, fundamental factors with a trigger. And here I would begin by looking at Germany, the new kid on the block, the new power at the centre of Europe, and Weltpolitik, the world policy of its Kaiser. I would then look at events in the Balkans, the weakening Turkish or Ottoman Empire, and the rise of nationalism amongst Balkan states, Serbia in particular, but not only Serbia, and kind of hovering like vultures to pick up what pieces it can, the two powers with most interest in the Balkans, Russia and Austria-Hungary. And the third long-term factor or fundamental factor for me would be international anarchy, the developing alliances and the increasing militarization, particularly in Germany, but not only Germany. Think of the Anglo-German naval race, for example. So there are our long-term factors or our fundamental factors. Our short-term factors or our trigger would be the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and the July crisis that follows, and that plummets Europe into a major war. And two past exam questions for you, one from paper 2, one from paper 3, that actually identify long and short-term causes in the question. Now, a focus on Germany. I would begin with context, and for me, the context would be the impact of German unification. The fact that Germany was unified through Bismarck's policy of blood and iron, by military might and by economic might, and by two wars, one against Austria-Hungary and one against France. And then I would look at Wilhelm II, the Kaiser who introduced the policy of Weltpolitik, the Kaiser that wanted to make Germany a power to be respected, maybe also a power to be feared, and himself to be respected as a mighty emperor. And this leads us to Germany raising tensions. And here I think it's a chance to, it's a chance to focus on the Moroccan crises in particular. But I would also look at Germany and the Balkans, the Berlin-Baghdad railway, and an increasing German presence in Constantinople that is so important to Russia. But to balance this in a question that will focus on Germany, I would look at Austria-Hungary and I would look at Russia. A past exam question that I think brings us to a focus on Germany. German foreign policy did not lead to the outbreak of the First World War. Discuss. Let's move on to a focus on the Balkans. And here I've talked about Balkan nationalism and Turkish weakness, so I'm not going to repeat that. I've also talked about Austria-Hungary and Russia in the Balkans. We could use Bosnia-Herzegovina as the central focal point for our examination of that. And I've already talked about Germany in the Balkans. To balance it, I would bring in international anarchy. Not going to talk about that now because that's our next focus. A past exam question for you. To what extent was Balkan nationalism a significant cause of the First World War? So you can see how my essay plan there would work for that question. Now, a focus on international anarchy. We have the alliances. Now here I would talk about how their defensive nature became aggressive because they identified enemies and they resulted in bigger armies and war plans. And crucially, that need to mobilize. But we'll come to that again in a minute. I would look at the naval race between Britain and Germany, and I would bring in Wilhelm and Weltpolitik and how the likes of the Kruger telegram, the Moroccan crises and stirring things in Constantinople added to this sense of lawlessness in Europe. The Balkans comes into this as well, and I've already talked about Russia and Austria-Hungary and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and here I've put the Bosnian Crisis as an example. And then I said I would bring in mobilization. We have this issue in the July crisis where really the military take over the decision making from the politicians. And they say, look guys, if we don't mobilize quickly, if we don't mobilize before the other side mobilizes, we're going to be defeated before a war even begins. And so the anarchy continues right to the last moment. Two questions that I think lend themselves to a look at, to a focus on international anarchy, with reference to one Allied power and one Central power examine the reasons for their involvement in the First World War. The failure to manage the international crisis of July 1914 led to the outbreak of the First World War. Now, something I want to point out before I finish. If we go back to the first, if we go back to the first focal point, the long-term and short-term factors, these topics, these factors, Germany and Weltpolitik, events in the Balkans, international anarchy, the July crisis, they appear in all the other focal points. This is the core that you need to learn. This is the knowledge that you need to have, with a specific focal point for a question, whether it be Germany, whether it be the Balkans, whether it be international anarchy. It's a matter of you adapting this knowledge to that specific question. And you do that by analysing past questions and by practicing your essay plans. So there we have our our look at the causes of World War One. I hope that was useful for you. If it didn't give you anything new, at least it served as a refresher. As always, don't forget to check out my History Made Easier website, and as always, thank you for listening. Cheers.